Purgatorio is the second part of Dante's Divine Comedy, following the Inferno and preceding the Paradiso. The poem was written in the early 14th century. It is an allegory telling of the climb of Dante up the Mount of Purgatory, guided by the Roman poet Virgil, except for the last 4 cantos, at which point Beatrice takes over as Dante's guide. Purgatory in the poem is depicted as a mountain in the southern hemisphere, consisting of a bottom section, anti-purgatory, 7 levels of suffering and spiritual growth, associated with the 7 deadly sins, and finally the earthly paradise at the top. Allegorically, the Purgatorio represents the penitent Christian life. In describing the climb, Dante discusses the nature of sin, examples of vice and virtue, as well as moral issues in politics and in the church. The poem outlines a theory that all sins arise from love, either perverted love directed towards others' harm, or deficient love, or the disordered or excessive love of good things. As described in the Inferno, the first 24 hours of Dante's journey took place on Earth and started on the evening of Maundy Thursday, the 24th of March, or the 7th of April, 1300, and the next full day, Good Friday, was spent exploring the depths of hell with Virgil as a guide. Dante and Virgil spent the next day ascending from hell to see the stars. They arrive at the shore of the mountain of Purgatory, the only land in the southern hemisphere, at 6 a.m. on Easter Sunday, which is 6 p.m. on Sunday in Jerusalem, since the 2 points are antipodal. Dante describes hell as existing underneath Jerusalem, having been created by the impact of Lucifer's fall. The mountain of Purgatory was created by a displacement of rock caused by the same event. The Purgatorio picks up where the Inferno left off, describing Dante's 3 1/4 day trip up the mountain that ends with Dante in the earthly paradise at the time of noon on Wednesday, March 30th, or April 13th. Part 1. The Anti-Purgatory. From the shore of the island. In Canto 1, Dante begins the Purgatorio by invoking the Muses. In verses 4 to 9, with the sun rising on Easter Sunday, Dante announces his intention to describe purgatory by invoking the mythical Greek Muses, as he did in Canto 2 of the Inferno. At the shores of Purgatory, Dante and Virgil meet Cato, a pagan who was placed by God as the general guardian of the approach to the mountain. The Purgatorio demonstrates the medieval knowledge of a spherical Earth, with Dante referencing the different stars visible in the southern hemisphere, the altered position of the sun, and the various time zones of the Earth. For instance, at the start of Canto 2, the reader learns that it is dawn in Purgatory. Dante conveys this concept by explaining that it is sunset at Jerusalem, antipodal to the Mount of Purgatory, midnight, 6 hours later, over India on the river Ganges, with the constellation Libra overhead there, and noon, 6 hours earlier, over Spain. The climb is conceived as taking place during the vernal equinox, when the days and nights are of the same length. In a contrast to Charon's ferry across the Acheron in the Inferno, Christian souls are escorted by an angel boatman from their gathering place somewhere near Ostia, the seaport of Rome at the mouth of the Tiber, through the Pillars of Hercules across the seas to the mountain of Purgatory. The souls arrive chanting in Exitu Israel de Egipto in Canto 2. In his letter to his patron in Verona, Cangrande della Scala, Dante explains that this reference to Israel leaving Egypt refers both to the redemption of Christ and to the conversion of the soul from the sorrow and misery of sin, to the state of grace. The first stage of the anti-purgatory begins after they have left the shores and moved towards the mountain. The poets begin to climb in the early hours of morning. On the lower slopes, the pilgrim and Virgil encounter 2 main categories of souls whose penitent Christian life was delayed or deficient: the excommunicate and the late repentant. The former are detained at the base of the cliff for a period 30 times as long as their period of contumacy. The excommunicate include Manfred of Sicily. Manfred explains that prayer from those currently alive and in the grace of God may reduce the amount of time a soul spends in purgatory. The meeting with Manfred is over by around 9 a.m. in Canto 3. The late repentant includes the indolent who were too lazy or too preoccupied to repent, those who repented at the last minute without formally receiving last rites as a result of violent deaths, and the negligent rulers. These souls will be admitted to purgatory thanks to their genuine repentance, but must wait outside for an amount of time equal to their lives on earth. The lazy include Belacqua, who was possibly a deceased friend of Dante, whom the pilgrim is relieved to discover here, rather than in the Inferno. The meeting with Belacqua is over by noon, in Canto 5. Those not receiving the last rites include Pia de Tolomei of Siena, who was murdered by her husband, Nello della Pietra of the Maremma. Also in this category is the troubadour Sordello who, like Virgil, is from Mantova. When Sordello discovers the great poet Virgil's identity, he bows down to him in honor. This helps keeping Virgil in the foreground of the poem. Since as a resident of Limbo he is less qualified as a guide here than he was in the Inferno. As a resident of Purgatory, the poet Sordello is able to explain the rules of the mountain, that after sunset the souls are incapable of climbing any further. Allegorically, the sun represents God, meaning that progress in the penitent Christian life can only be made through divine grace. Virgil's conversation with Sordello ends as the sun is moving downward, that is, after 3 p.m. in Canto 7. It is now sunset, so the pilgrim and his companions stop for the night in the beautiful Valley of the Princes, where they meet persons whose preoccupation with public and private duties hampered him from spiritual progress, particularly deceased monarchs such as Rudolph, Ottokar, Philip the Bold, and Henry III. John Chardy writes that these negligent rulers are elevated above their negligent subjects because their special duties made it difficult for them to think about the welfare of their own souls. The pilgrim also speaks with the souls of the contemporary Italian statesmen Corrado Malaspina and Nino Visconti, the latter being a personal friend whom Dante rejoices at not having found among the damned. As night approaches, the souls sing the Compline hymns Salve Regina and Te Lucis Ante Terminum. The pilgrim falls asleep at 8:30 p.m. His dream takes place just before the dawn of Easter Monday, and he awakens just after 8 a.m. Waking up, the pilgrim finds that he has been carried up to the Gate of Purgatory proper. The stairs before the gate has 3 steps, polished white, being a mirror and to reflect the purity of the penitent's true self. Black being the color of mourning, which is cracked in the shape of a Christian cross, and red which is symbolizing the blood of Christ and the necessary work needed for the restoration of true life. The Gate of Purgatory in Canto 9, Peter's Gate, is guarded by an angel bearing a naked sword, his countenance too bright for the pilgrim's sight to sustain. In reply to the angel's challenge, Virgil declares that a lady from heaven brought them there and directed him to the gate. On Virgil's advice, the pilgrim mounts the steps and pleads humbly for admission by the angel, who uses the point of his sword to draw the letter P, which is signifying peccatum or sin, 7 times on the pilgrim's forehead, bidding him to take heed that thou wash these wounds, when thou shalt be within. With the passage of each terrace and the corresponding purgation of his soul that the pilgrim receives, one of the P's will be erased by the angel each time granting passage to the next terrace. The angel at Peter's Gate uses 2 keys, silver which symbolizes the competence to evaluate the authenticity of the repentant, and gold which symbolizes the authority to open the gate, both which are necessary for redemption and salvation. As the poets are about to enter the gate, they are warned not to look back. Part 2. The 7 Terraces of Purgatory. After passing through the Gate of Purgatory proper, Virgil guides the pilgrim through the mountain's 7 terraces. These correspond to the 7 deadly sins or 7 roots of sinfulness: pride, envy, wrath, sloth, avarice and prodigality, gluttony, and lust. The classification of sin here is more psychological than that of the Inferno, being based on motives, rather than actions. It is also drawn primarily from Christian theology, rather than from classical sources. The core of the classification is based on love. The first 3 terraces of purgatory relate to perverted love directed towards actual harm of others. The 4th terrace relates to deficient love, with examples of sloth or acedia, and the last 3 terraces relate to excessive or disordered love of good things. Each terrace purges a particular sin in an appropriate manner. Those in purgatory can leave their terrace voluntarily, but may only do so when they have corrected the flaw within themselves that led to committing that sin. The structure of the poetic description of these terraces is more systematic than that of the Inferno, and associated with each terrace are an appropriate prayer and beatitude. Robert Hollander describes the shared features of all the terraces as description of the physical aspect of the terrace, exemplars of the virtue that counters the sin repented here, description of the penitents, recitation of their sins by particular penitents, exemplars of the vice, appearance to the pilgrim of the angel representing the countering virtue. First terrace, of pride. The first three terraces of purgatory relate to sins caused by a perverted love directed towards actual harm of others. The first of these sins is pride. The pilgrim and Virgil begin to ascend this terrace shortly after 9 a.m. On the terrace where proud souls purge their sin, the pilgrim and Virgil see beautiful sculptures expressing humility, the opposite virtue. The first example is of the Annunciation to the Virgin Mary, where she responds to the angel Gabriel with the words Ecce ancilla Dei, meaning, "Behold the handmaid of the Lord," from Luke chapter 1 verse 38. An example of humility from classical history is the Emperor Trajan, who, according to a medieval legend, once stopped his journey to render justice to a poor widow, in Canto 10. After being introduced to humility, Dante and Virgil meet the souls of the proud, who are bent over by the weight of huge stones on their backs. As they walk around the terrace, they are able to profit from the sculpted examples of humility. The first of these souls is Umberto Aldobrandeschi, whose pride lies in his descent. I was Italian, son of a great Tuscan. My father was Guglielmo Aldobrandesco. Although he is learning to be more humble. I do not know if you have heard his name. Odorizzi of Gubbio is an example of pride in achievements. He was a noted artist of illuminated manuscripts. Provenzano Salvani, leader of the Sienese Ghibellines, is an example of pride in dominating others, in Canto 11. In Canto 12, Dante points out, with frank self-awareness, that pride is also a serious flaw of his own. After his conversations with the proud, the pilgrim notes further sculptures on the pavement below, this time illustrating pride itself. The sculptures show Satan, or Lucifer, the building of the Tower of Babel, King Saul, Niobe, Arachne, King Rehoboam, and others. The poets reach the stairway to the second terrace at noon. As they ascend, the angel of humility salutes them and brushes the pilgrim's forehead with his wings, erasing the letter P for peccatum, corresponding to the sin of pride, and Dante hears the beatitude of Beati Paupers Spiritu, meaning blessed are the poor in spirit, from Matthew chapter 5 verse 3, in Canto 12. Dante is surprised to discover that climbing now seems easier than it did before. Virgil tells him that one of the initials has been removed from his forehead by the angel and that the effort will be increasingly lessened as he climbs higher. Dante compares the stairway to the easy ascent from the Rubicante, a bridge in Florence, up to San Miniato al Monte, overlooking the city. Second terrace of envy. Envy is the sin that looks with grudging hatred upon other men's gifts and good fortune, taking every opportunity to run them down or deprive them of their happiness, this in contrast to covetousness, the excessive desire to have things like money, as one of the envious souls on this terrace says. My blood was so afire with envy that when I had seen a man becoming happy, the lividness in me was plain to see. On entering the terrace of the envious, the pilgrim and Virgil first hear voices on the air telling stories of generosity, the opposite virtue. There is, as in all the other terraces, an episode from the life of the Virgin Mary. This time, the scene from the life of the Virgin is the wedding at Cana, in which she expresses her joy for the newly married couple and encourages Christ to perform his first miracle. There is also Jesus's saying, "Love your enemies." A classical story shows the friendship between Orestes and Pylades. The souls of the envious wear penitential grey cloaks, and their eyes are sewn shut with iron wire, resembling the way a falconer sews shut the eyes of a falcon in order to train it. This results in audible, rather than visual examples here, in Canto 13. The souls of the envious include Guido del Duca, who speaks bitterly about the ethics of people in towns along the river Arno. The voices in the air also include examples of envy. The classical example is Aglaros, who, according to Ovid, was turned to stone because she was jealous of Hermes' love for her older sister Herse. The biblical example is Cain, mentioned here not for his act of fratricide, but for the jealousy of his younger brother Abel that led to it. It is mid-afternoon and the poets are walking westward along the terrace with the sun in their faces. A dazzling brightness suddenly smites the pilgrim on the brow, which he supposes is caused by the sun. But when he shades his eyes from it, the new brightness persists, and he is forced to close his eyes. Virgil reminds him that the approach of an angel is still too powerful for his earthly senses but says that this will not always be so. The angel of charity, having brushed away another P from the pilgrim's brow, invites him to mount to the next terrace. As he is leaving the terrace, the dazzling light of the terrace's angel causes the pilgrim to reveal his scientific knowledge, observing that the angle of incidence is equal to the angle of reflection, as theory and experiment will show. The third terrace of wrath. On the terrace of the wrathful, which the poets reach at 3 p.m., examples of meekness, the opposite virtue of wrath, are given to the pilgrim as visions in his mind. The scene from the life of the Virgin in this terrace of purgation is from the finding in the temple. Whereas most parents would be angry at their child for worrying them, Mary is loving and understanding of Christ's motives behind his 3-day disappearance. In a classical example, the wife of Pisistratos wanted a young man executed for embracing their daughter, to which Pisistratos responded, "What shall we do to one who'd injure us, if one who loves us earns our condemnation?" Saint Stephen provides a biblical example, drawn from Acts chapter 7 verses 54 to 60, in Canto 15. The souls of the wrathful walk around in blinding acrid smoke, which symbolizes the blinding effect of anger. The prayer for this terrace is the Agnus Dei, qui tollis peccata mundi, miserere nobis, dona nobis pacem, meaning, Lamb of God, you who take away the sins of the world, have mercy upon us. Grant us peace. Marco Lombardo discourses with the pilgrim on free will. A relevant topic, since there is no point being angry with someone who has no choice over his actions, in Canto 16. The pilgrim also sees visions with examples of wrath, such as Prachne, Haman and Lavinia. When the visions have passed, the angel of peace appears to greet them. Again the brightness overpowers the pilgrim's sight, but he hears the angel's invitation to mount to the next terrace and feels a wing brush his forehead, erasing the third P. Then follows the pronouncing of the beatitude Beati Pacifici, meaning, blessed are the peacemakers. The poets leave the third terrace just after nightfall. While arriving on the fourth terrace, Virgil is able to explain to the pilgrim the organization of purgatory and its relationship to perverted, deficient, or misdirected love. The 3 terraces they have seen so far have purged the proud, as in, he who, through abasement of another, hopes for supremacy, the envious, meaning, one who, when he is outdone, fears his own loss of fame, power, honor, favor. His sadness loves misfortune for his neighbor. And the wrathful, he who, over injury received, resentful, for revenge grows greedy, and, angrily, seeks out another's harm. Deficient and misdirected loves are about to follow. Virgil's discourse on love concludes at midnight, in Canto 18. Fourth terrace of sloth. On the fourth terrace we find souls whose sin was that of deficient love, that is, sloth or acedia. Since they had failed in life to act in pursuit of love, here they are engaged in ceaseless activity. The examples of sloth and of zeal, its opposite virtue, are called out by these souls as they run around the terrace. A scene from the life of the Virgin outlined in this terrace is the Visitation, with Mary going, in haste, to visit her cousin Elizabeth. These examples also include episodes from the lives of Julius Caesar and Aeneas. This activity also replaces a verbal prayer for this terrace. Since the formerly slothful are now too busy to converse at length, this section of the poem is a short one. Allegorically, spiritual laziness and lack of caring lead to sadness. And so the beatitude for this terrace is, Beati qui lugent, meaning, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted," from Matthew chapter 5 verse 4. The pilgrim's second night's sleep occurs while the poets are on this terrace, and the pilgrim dreams shortly before Tuesday's dawn of a siren, a symbol of disordered or excessive love represented by greed, gluttony and lust. Upon awakening from the dream in the light of the sun, the pilgrim is visited by the angel of zeal, who removes another P from his brow, and the two poets climb toward the fifth terrace, in Canto 19. Fifth Terrace of Avarice. On the last three terraces are those who sinned by loving good things, but loving them in an excessive or disordered way. On the fifth terrace, excessive concern for earthly goods, whether in the form of greed, ambition or extravagance, is punished and purified. The avaricious and prodigal lie face down on the ground, reciting the psalm, Adacit pavimento anima mea, taken from Psalm chapter 119 verse 25, meaning, "My soul cleaveth unto the dust, quicken thou me according to thy word," which is a prayer expressing the desire to follow the divine's law. The pilgrim meets the shade of Pope Adrian V, an exemplar of desire for ecclesiastical power and prestige, who directs the poets on their way. The scene from the life of Virgin Mary, used here to counter the sin of avarice or greed, is the humble birth of Christ. Further down the terrace, Hugh the Great personifies greed for worldly wealth and possessions. He bemoans the way that, in contrast, avarice has motivated the actions of his successors, and prophesies events which occurred after the date in which the poem is set, but before the poem was written. These events include Charles II of Naples selling his daughter into marriage to an elderly and disreputable man, and Philip IV of France, the fleur de lis, arresting Pope Boniface VIII in 1303, a pope destined for hell according to the Inferno, but still, in Dante's view, the vicar of Christ. Dante also refers to the suppression of the Knights Templar at Philip's instigation in 1307, which freed Philip from debts he owed to the order. Following the exemplars of avarice, which are Pygmalion, Midas, Achan, Ananias and Sapphira, Heliodorus, Polymaster, and Crassus, there is a sudden earthquake accompanied by the unison shouting from all the souls of Gloria in excelsis Deo, meaning, glory to the divine, in the highest. The pilgrim desires to understand the cause of the earthquake, but he does not question Virgil about it. In a scene that Dante links to the episode where Jesus meets two disciples on the road to Emmaus, the pilgrim and Virgil are overtaken by a shade who eventually reveals himself as the Roman poet Statius, author of the Thebaid. Statius explains the cause of the earthquake. There is a tremor when a soul knows that it is ready to ascend to heaven, which he has just experienced. Dante presents Statius, without obvious or understandable basis, as a convert to Christianity. As a Christian, his guidance will supplement that of Virgil's. Statius is overjoyed to find himself in the company of Virgil, whose Aeneid he so greatly admired. The angel of moderation directs the poets to the passage leading to the next region after brushing another P from the pilgrim's forehead. Virgil and Statius converse as they ascend toward the next ledge. Statius explains that he was not avaricious but prodigal, but that he converted from prodigality by reading Virgil, which directed him to poetry and to the divine. Statius explains how he was baptized, but how he kept his faith a secret. This is the cause of his purgation of sloth on the previous terrace. Statius asks Virgil to name his fellow poets and figures in limbo, which he does. Sixth Terrace, Gluttony. It is between 10 and 11 a.m., and the three poets begin to circle the sixth terrace where the gluttonous are purged, and more generally, those who over-emphasized food, drink, and bodily comforts. In a scene reminiscent of the punishment of Tantalus, they are starved in the presence of trees whose fruit is forever out of reach. The examples here are given by voices in the trees, which also symbolizes the first theophany, or showing of the divine, after the spiritual release of the earthquake on Terrace 5. The Virgin Mary, who shared her son's gifts with others at the wedding at Cana, and John the Baptist, who only lived on locusts and honey, in Matthew chapter 3 verse 4, is an example of the virtue of temperance. A classical example of the opposite vice of gluttony is the drunkenness of the centaurs that led to the battle of centaurs and Lapiths. The prayer for this terrace is, Labia mea Domini, from Psalm chapter 51 verse 15. O Lord, open my lips, and my mouth will declare your praise. These are the opening words from the daily liturgy of the hours, which is also the source of prayers for the 5th and 7th terraces, in cantos 22 through 24. Here Dante also meets his friend Forci Donati and his poetic predecessor Bonagiunta Orbiciani. Bonagiunta has kind words for Dante's earlier poem, La Vita Nuova, describing it as the dolce stil novo, meaning, sweet new style. He quotes the line, ladies that have intelligence of love, written in praise of Beatrice, whom he will meet later in the Purgatorio. The pilgrim is now greeted by the angel of temperance, whose brightness is like the red glow of molten metal or glass. Showing the passage up the mountain, the angel removes another P from the pilgrim's brow with a puff of his wing, and he pronounces the beatitude in paraphrase, Blessed are they who are so illumined by grace that the love of food does not kindle their desires beyond what is fitting. It is 2 p.m. when the three poets leave the 6th terrace and begin their ascent to the 7th terrace, meaning that they have spent 4 hours among the gluttonous. During the climb, the pilgrim wonders how it is possible for bodiless souls to have the gaunt appearance of the souls being starved here. In explaining, Statius discourses on the nature of the soul and its relationship to the body. 7th Terrace, Lust. The terrace of the lustful has an immense wall of flame through which everyone must pass. As a prayer, they sing the hymn Semi Deus Clementiae, meaning God of supreme clemency, from the Liturgy of the Hours. Souls repenting of misdirected physical desire call forth in praises of chastity and marital fidelity, with the Virgin Mary's chastity and the chastity of Diana, in Canto 25. 2 groups of souls run through the flames calling out examples of lust, and as they circle the 7th terrace, the 2 groups of penitents greet each other in a way Dante compares to ants. Among the flames, which he dare not enter, are the poets of love Guido Guinizelli and Arnulf Daniel, with whom Dante speaks, in Canto 26. Shortly before sunset, the poets are greeted by the angel of chastity, who instructs them to pass through the wall of fire. By reminding Dante that Beatrice can be found in the earthly paradise on the other side, Virgil finally persuades Dante to pass through the intense fire. After the poets pass through the flame, the sun sets and they lie down to sleep on the steps between the final terrace and the earthly paradise. On these steps, just before the dawn of Wednesday morning, Dante has his third dream, a vision of Leah and Rachel. They are symbols of the active, non-monastic, and contemplative, monastic, Christian lives, both of which are important. Dante awakens with the dawn, and the poets continue up the rest of the ascent until they come in sight of the earthly paradise. The earthly paradise. At the summit of Mount Purgatory is the earthly paradise or the Garden of Eden. Allegorically, it represents the state of innocence that existed before Adam and Eve fell from grace, the state which the pilgrim's journey up Mount Purgatory has been recapturing. Here the pilgrim and Virgil meet Matilda, who prepares the pilgrim for the meeting with Beatrice, who allegorically symbolizes theology and the path to the divine. With Matilda, the pilgrim witnesses a pageant which forms an allegory within the allegory. It has a somewhat different style from the Purgatorio as a whole, and with similarities with the symbolic language of the Revelation by St. John. The pageant consists of 24 elders, a reference to Revelation chapter 4 verse 4, representing the 24 books of the Hebrew Bible, as classified by Jerome. 4 animals with 6 wings as plumage, a reference to Revelation chapter 4 verses 6 to 8, a traditional representation of the 4 Evangelists. A chariot triumphal on 2 wheels, bearing Beatrice, which is drawn by a griffin, representing the unity of divinity and humanity in Christ. 3 circling maids, colored red, green, and white, representing the 3 theological virtues, love or charity, hope, and faith, respectively. 4 other maids dressed in purple, representing the 4 cardinal virtues: prudence, justice, temperance, and fortitude. 2 elders, different in their dress, representing the Acts of the Apostles and the Pauline epistle. 4 of humble aspect, representing the General Epistles. Last of all, an old man, by himself, representing the Book of Revelation. The appearance of Beatrice, and a dramatic reconciliation scene between Beatrice and Dante, in which she rebukes his sin in an allegory of the final judgment, helps to cover the disappearance of Virgil, who, as a symbol of non-Christian philosophy and humanities, can help him no further in his approach to the divine, and in the rest of the journey towards paradise, until the last 3 cantos in Paradiso. Beatrice will be the pilgrim's guide. Dante then passes through the river Lethe, which erases the memory of past sin, and sees an allegory of biblical and church history. This allegory includes a denunciation of the corrupt papacy of the time. A harlot, the papacy, is dragged away with the chariot, the church, by a giant, meaning the French monarchy, which under King Philip IV engineered the move of the papal seat to Avignon in 1309. It is known as the events observed in the earthly paradise come to a close. Finally, the pilgrim drinks from the river Uno, which restores the memories of the good, and prepares him for his ascent to heaven, described in the Paradiso, the final cantica. As with the other 2 parts of the Divine Comedy, the Purgatorio ends with the word stars.